The peach struck her shoulder just as she reached for her glass. Not dropped. Not accidentally brushed off a plate. It was thrown, deliberately and overhand, by someone who wanted everyone to see. Marjorie Caldwell froze mid-motion as the juice seeped through her velvet gown, running down her collarbone like humiliation given color and heat. She didn't need to turn her head to know who'd done it. The mayor's wife sat in the corner with a smile that belonged on a predator. Not a hostess. Someone muttered just loud enough for the chandeliered ceiling to catch the words and bounce them around like music. That's for stealing husbands with money. Not love. The Prescott Founders Banquet, a grand tradition dressed in lace, silver, and lies, went still. Crystal glasses hovered mid-air, frozen forks half lowered, as if the whole hall had been paused by God himself. But no one intervened, no gasp of protest, no apology, no gentle hand offering her a napkin. The crowd, people she'd once called friends, some of whom had wept at her husband's funeral, sat and watched as she dabbed at the nectar-stained dress that had, for one night, been her attempt at reclaiming grace. It was too much to bear, and not enough to break her. 3 winters ago, she had stood in the snow, burying Harold Caldwell, the railroad magnate, the county's beloved benefactor, her husband. The widowhood had initially cloaked her in sympathy, polite invitations, casseroles left at her doorstep, ladies who clutched her hands too tightly and asked after her grief like it was a performance they expected to critique. But the mourning period expired faster than anyone said aloud. The sympathy soured, turned into something sticky and dark. Her wealth outlasted their patience. Her name was suddenly heavier in their mouths. Her clothing too fine, her steps too confident. Every visit became a rumor. Every smile a manipulation. They had been waiting, counting down the months, sharpening their suspicions like knives at a supper table. By spring, they stopped pretending. By summer, they whispered while she passed. And by this evening, they had chosen spectacle over silence. She rose without a word, folded her napkin with an elegance that mocked the insult, turned her back on the clinking cutlery and suppressed smirks, and walked out of the Prescott Hall alone. Behind her, the music resumed, a waltz. Ironically, as if nothing had happened. As if she had simply never existed. Outside, the wind slapped her bare skin where the peach juice had dried and stiffened. Her carriage was not there. Her driver, who had worked for her late husband for a decade, had vanished without notice or explanation. No one had fetched her coat. No one had followed. No one cared. She walked. The streets, cobbled and glistening with frost, seemed too quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel loud just by breathing. Lanterns flickered behind thick glass windows, drawing silhouettes of families she would never be invited to join again. Curtains twitched, but no door opened. Her footsteps echoed over the stones, following her like judgment. She walked past the stables, past the iron-gated churchyard where Harold lay beneath a name too heavy with legacy. She passed the post office where the gossips worked and the library where they'd once praised her for donating fine-bound editions of Shakespeare and Whitman. Now they'd spit her name like a curse, like a warning to other women not to shine too brightly. Marjorie reached her estate after 6 blocks of this slow, deliberate exile. The house, tall and white-columned, had once been the pride of the county, bought with rail money, polished with widowhood. Tonight, it loomed like a tomb. She didn't light the lamps, didn't call for the maid, didn't remove her gloves. She went to the parlor, undressed methodically, and folded the velvet gown, still wet with the evidence of her shame, into the belly of the iron stove. As she watched the fire catch, she felt no fury, no scream clawed at her throat, only silence, heavy, endless silence. It didn't feel like a breaking. It felt like a shedding, a funeral for the woman she used to be. In that moment, she understood something cruel and absolute. She had been loved only as an extension of her husband. Without Harold, she was not a person. They didn't see her anymore. She was a purse, a threat, a cautionary tale. What they hated wasn't who she was. What they hated was that she'd survived him. And they had punished her for it. 2 days later, Marjorie left the house before dawn. Not a word to the house staff. No farewell letter. She packed one satchel, took a horse no one would miss, and carried with her a deed Harold once called useless, land bordering Apache country. Too wild, Too barren for cattle. Too dangerous for investment. But she wasn't looking for yield. She wasn't looking to belong. She was looking to disappear. To escape the velvet prisons and sugar-coated cruelty of a town that kissed her hand in winter and stabbed her back in spring. She was done with pearl necklaces and parasol gossip. Done with pretending that she was anything less than abandoned. They had thrown a peach like a verdict. And in walking away, she wrote her own. The wind had softened by the time Marjorie reached the canyon rim. Carrying not judgment but whispers of cedar and old earth. She had been riding for hours through land Harold once called unfit for cattle. A waste of good coin. But there was something about the silence here, vast. Uninterrupted, that didn't feel empty. It felt open, like a breath held just before a song. Her mare stopped suddenly, hooves crunching on shale, ears pricking forward. Marjorie followed the horse's gaze. There, standing barefoot on a flat rock, was a child. A boy, no more than 7, wrapped in a turquoise blanket that swallowed his frame but did nothing to diminish the steadiness in his eyes. He didn't move when she dismounted. Didn't flinch when she stepped closer. He only raised one arm and pointed to her saddle. Then behind him. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't even a request. It was something older than language, an invitation. Marjorie hesitated, then untied the small sack from her saddle and followed him. The trail he led her through twisted between cliffs and thick tufts of dry grass, narrowing in places where even the breeze had to squeeze through. And yet the boy walked with the sure steps of someone who belonged to the land. Not just on it, in it. After nearly half an hour, they reached a clearing hidden behind a line of scrub cedar. There were no houses, no fences or gardens, only a ring of stones where a fire had once lived, and 4 makeshift shelters made from hide, branches, and what looked like pieces of canvas long since browned by sun and rain. And children. 3 of them, younger than the boy, one with her foot wrapped in cloth, cradling it gently as she sat. Another clutched a wooden figure, roughly carved but clearly loved. The third held a rabbit so still it could have been sleeping. They watched her with wide, alert eyes, but not fear. No one ran, no one cried. Marjorie knelt slowly, letting the sack fall open beside her. She pulled out a tin of beans, 2 apples, and a piece of bread she had saved for her own journey. The sugar cube, just one, she hesitated over, then unwrapped and placed in the center. The boy gestured once toward the food, and the others crept forward with the quiet grace of deer. No one grabbed, no one spoke. They simply accepted, small hands breaking bread, chewing with practiced patience, their eyes still flicking back to her like she might disappear. Marjorie didn't try to speak. What words could she offer that would matter more than the warmth in her hands or the peace in her eyes? Instead, she sat by the fire ring and let the silence gather around them like a shawl. As dusk fell, the boy brought her another blanket, this one worn but whole, patterned in blue and red threads. He offered it without explanation. She took it with a quiet nod, pulling it around her shoulders as the stars began to emerge like slow drifting embers in the sky. That night, she lay by the fire. The children pressed close for warmth. She listened to their breathing, felt their tiny heartbeats through the fabric. And for the first time since Harold's death, she slept without dreams. In the morning, the fire was lit again, not by her, but by a hand that moved with skill and ritual. Across from the flame stood a tall man, his long hair braided with feathers and bone, his chest bare beneath a wrap of dark deerskin. In one hand he held a staff adorned with turquoise stones, in the other, nothing but stillness. Marjorie stood slowly, brushing the dust from her skirt. The boy spoke then, a string of soft syllables in a language she didn't know. The man listened, nodded once, and walked toward her. She braced herself, expecting a demand, a challenge, but the chief said nothing. He simply placed a small satchel at her feet and stepped back. Inside, dried berries, strips of rabbit, and cloth folded with care. Her throat tightened. "Why?" she whispered. He pointed, first to the children, then to her heart. And in that simple motion, she understood. They were alive because of her. That morning, the children began to teach her. Not with words, but with gestures, smiles, laughter. They showed her how to pull bark from the dry birch, how to find the fat worms near river stones, How to press leaves to her lips before chewing for fever. Her hands grew wise before her mouth ever caught up. The little girl with the carved doll tied flowers into her braids one afternoon and twirled when Marjorie clapped. The smallest boy placed a pinecone in her lap without reason, as if gifting her the whole forest in miniature. She laughed often, real, unmeasured laughter, the kind she hadn't known she missed until it spilled out of her like song. And every night, the boy gave her something small, a stone shaped like a heart. A feather he found tangled in brush. A twig that looked like a bird. Each token was wordless trust, layered like petals. By the second week, the children no longer waited to see if she would return. They simply woke with her, walked with her, sat beside her at firelight. One night, as the wind curled soft around the canyon's edge, the chief placed a carved stone near the fire. Its surface bore a symbol, 4 long marks. One short, then circled. When she pointed to it in confusion, the boy smiled, tapped his own chest, then hers, and said, "Soda." She didn't understand until later, when they all began calling her the same. Soda, the one who stays, not the guest, not the woman with coin, but the one whose warmth did not leave when the food was gone. And in their smiles, their games, their sleepy murmurs at night, she saw it clearly, she had become something she never thought she would be again. Not needed, beloved. By the time the snow melted and the cedar branches began to bend with the weight of new buds, she no longer flinched at her own reflection. Marjorie Caldwell, the woman who once walked through banquet halls with a name too heavy for her shoulders, was gone. Not buried, not forgotten, but shed like an old skin. What remained was something leaner, stronger, something true. They had begun calling her Jana 3 moons ago. It started with the smallest child, the one with the carved doll and laugh like chimes. One evening, after Jana had bandaged her scraped knee and whispered a quiet story about a hawk who lost its way, the girl nestled into her shawl and murmured, "Jana." Jana didn't understand at first. She thought it was a child's mispronunciation or a name passed from the wind. But then Toya, the sharp-eyed girl who learned fastest and spoke little, said it too. Then Kota, then the twins. When she finally asked the chief, he looked at her for a long moment, then said in his thick accented English, "Jana means the fire that stays." And just like that, she had been renamed, not because she asked, not because she demanded a place, because she had earned one. Blank, underscore, blank. Her hands, once delicate from society's expectations, were now calloused from cutting bark and stitching hide. She no longer wore gloves, only ash and earth. Her hair, once curled with hot irons, now hung in 2 braids woven with wildflower threads. The first time the women of the village let her braid their hair, she nearly wept, not from difficulty, but from what it meant. Trust, handed down in strands of silence and skill. Jana learned how to grind roots into salves, how to read clouds for coming storms, how to feel warmth beneath bark and know which tree would not live through spring. And the people saw her, not as a guest, not as a wounded bird, but as flame, quiet, resilient, essential. They brought her their sick children, their wounded dogs, their stories, their silence. And every time she gave, whether it was a stew, a wrap of herbs, or just a place beside her near the fire, something in her spine straightened. She was no longer offering from a place of desperation. She was giving from strength. Blank, underscore, blank. One evening, a storm rolled in hard and sudden. The sky cracked with thunder as sleet stung the earth. The children huddled close to her in the shelter, frightened, their small bodies pressing into her arms and sides like roots into soil. She lit the fire with practiced ease, shielding it with her back as she whispered calming words. "You're safe. I'm here. You're safe." The wind howled, but she didn't. They clung to her like she was shelter itself. And for the first time, she understood what it meant to be mother. Not by blood, but by choice. The storm passed, but it left something behind. The next morning, Toya entered her tent with a bundle wrapped in buckskin. Inside was a beaded necklace, quills, shells, small turquoise stones, and at the center, a polished bead carved like a flame. "You wear this now," Toya said simply. "It means you know how to stay." Jana touched the center flame with reverence. "Do I deserve it?" Toya tilted her head. Not everything is about deserving. Some things are about becoming. Blank, underscore, blank. Word spread quietly. The woman who had once been spit on at banquets now had her name whispered with respect across fire circles. She wasn't a novelty. She wasn't a charity case. She was one of them. Elders sought her advice about which herbs calmed fever best. Hunters asked her to bless their arrows. Children brought her trinkets, stones, feathers, pressed leaves, offered with the same sacredness she once saw in diamond necklaces and ballroom tiaras. But this meant more, because this wasn't given to her to impress. It was given because she had stayed when she could have run. Because she had listened when she could have judged. Because she had warmed others when no one had warmed her. Blank, underscore, blank. The moment of her full naming came not during ceremony, but necessity. One of the teenage boys returned with a deep gash in his side. The result of a fall on sharp stone while gathering winter stores. Blood soaked his tunic. Panic rippled through the camp. But Jana moved like water. Boil water, she ordered, hands already working. Hold his head steady. Tear the clean cloth. Not that one, the thin one. No one questioned her. No one second-guessed. Even the chief, silent and steady, stepped back to give her space. She cleaned the wound, stitched it carefully, wrapped it tight. Her fingers did not tremble. Her voice did not waver. And when it was over, when the boy breathed without pain and the color returned to his face, an old woman muttered, "The fire stayed with him." And so it did. Blank, underscore, blank. That night, the fire circle felt different. Not grand, not showy, but sacred. The chief stepped forward, holding something small in his palm, a carved figure made from cedar. When he placed it in her hands, she gasped. It was her. Not a doll, not a trophy, but her, shoulders wide, skirt to ankles, hair braided like the women of the tribe. "You are here," he said, "so now you stay." She held the carving to her chest, overwhelmed, not from flattery, but from being truly seen. Blank, underscore, blank. The next morning, a woman she barely knew greeted her at the stream. "Jana," she said softly, "thank you for staying." And just like that, the word Marjorie faded further. No one asked about the mansion. No one mentioned the banquet. No one cared who she had been. They only saw who she had become. And for the first time in her life, not as a wife, or widow, or charity, she stood tall in her own name. Jana, the fire that stays. And every smile she received, every child's hand that reached for hers, every quiet nod from the chief as he passed, was proof. She wasn't someone's guest. She was someone's home. The chickens scattered first. The morning had begun like so many others, smoke curling gently from cook fires. The scent of pine and boiled root rising into a pale blue sky. Jana had just finished teaching the twins how to tie bundles of dried herbs when the wind shifted. It carried something unfamiliar, heavy, sharp, hoofbeats. By the time she stood and stepped outside, 5 riders had broken through the tree line. Dust rising behind them like a storm kicked up from the past. They were men, white men, thin with winter, coated in pride and worn leather. Their hats were low, but their eyes were sharp. The kind of eyes that remembered what they believed they owned. She didn't speak. She didn't run. She walked to the center of the clearing and waited. The one in front dismounted with a groan and cracked a crooked grin. "Well, I'll be damned. You really did end up here." His voice rang like cracked glass in a room full of silence. Behind her, the children had gone still. Toya emerged from the shade, hands clenched. The man laughed. "Thought we'd never find you. Been a long trail, but land records don't lie. Your name's still Marjorie Dane. Widow of Philip Dane. That makes you, and everything you touch, ours." He said the word ours like a claim staked in blood. Like a brand. Jana didn't flinch. Her voice came out low, steady, and steel-lined. "I am not yours. Not now. Not ever." The other men shifted uneasily, eyes darting around the camp, clearly taking in the tipis. The children. The circle of people now gathering in quiet watchfulness. The man scoffed and spat into the dust. "Look at you," he sneered, "playing mother to a pack of savages? This ain't the life you were born for." Jana stepped forward, each movement deliberate, fire dancing in her spine. No. It's the life I became worthy of. For a heartbeat, silence held the camp in its palm. Then Toya stepped beside her. Chin lifted. She has a name here. The man looked down at the girl. Confused. I bet she's got plenty. He muttered. Always did know how to play people. He looked past Jana toward the chief, who stood still and calm at the edge of the circle, staff grounded at his side. You going to keep her? The man challenged. Make her your fire queen or whatever it is you do here? The chief didn't answer. But Jana did. She took one step forward, enough to cast her shadow across the man's boots. No one keeps me, she said. I stayed. It wasn't loud, but it cracked through the tension like lightning in dry sky. Another rider grumbled something. The lead man's face flushed, a mix of insult and disbelief brewing beneath the brim of his dusty hat. You think this little campfire kingdom protects you? You think their songs and stories make you belong? At that, one of the youngest boys, barely 10, walked calmly from the shelter. His feet bare, his eyes fierce. He stood beside Jana, folded his arms across his chest, and declared, She's not a widow, she's our flame. The man blinked. Jana reached out and rested her hand gently on the boy's shoulder. Go, she whispered. Feed the chickens. He hesitated, then obeyed. The men watched him go. Unsure now. Something had shifted. Power had changed hands without a weapon drawn. The quiet strength surrounding Jana, these people who stood not with swords. But presence was not something they understood. But they felt it. The chief finally stepped forward, eyes locked with the strangers. This woman, he said, his voice like gravel wrapped in thunder, is not your burden, not your shame. The lead rider let out a breath. Not a surrender, but something closer to defeat. Not the kind of defeat that ends in war, but the kind that realizes the ground has moved beneath your boots, and there's no getting it back. Without another word, the men turned. One mounted, another spat again, but they rode out the way they came, 5 shadows shrinking back into the pines. Jana stood rooted until the dust settled. Then she turned, to her people. Her family. They didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Their eyes said everything. The small ones came first, tugging at her shawl, placing stones in her palms like talismans. The women passed her water, rubbed her shoulders. Toya knelt to tie the bottom of her dress where it had snagged on a root. The chief said nothing, but when he passed her later near the stream, he stopped long enough to place a single feather in her hand. Not from an eagle or a crow, but a red-tailed hawk. She looked up, heart-catching. You stood like it flew, he said softly, eyes forward, no fear. That night, as the fire crackled in the center of camp, the elders told no stories. They simply let the silence speak for them. And in that silence, Jana sat with her head high, shoulders square, not as a woman who had defended herself, but as a woman who no longer needed to. Because no one would ever come to reclaim her again. Not as a possession, not as a scandal, not as a name on a deed. She had chosen this place. And more importantly, they had chosen her back. The mornings came slower now. Not because the sun rose any later, but because Jana no longer rushed to meet it. She didn't have to. The day waited for her as the children did, patiently. With the gentle confidence that she would be there. She always was. Her hands were no longer the delicate instruments of a widow trained in tea service and embroidery. They were the hands that plaited grass into baskets, ground roots into salve, braided hair for girls who had no mothers. And when those hands passed through the camp, people didn't look past her anymore. They looked to her. She had become the kind of woman who didn't need to be announced. Her presence was enough. Children greeted her not with bows or titles, but by slipping their small fingers into hers as she passed, or leaning their heads against her side without a word. The women sought her opinion about stew or storms or stitching patterns. The elders watched her with eyes soft as pine needles, the kind of gaze reserved only for things that had endured. And they never called her Marjorie. She was Jana, fire that stays. But to the children, she was more than a name. She was home. Blank, _ blank. One afternoon, the twins brought her a rolled-up piece of hide, smudged with berry ink and tiny charcoal symbols. They unwrapped it proudly on her lap while she sat beneath the cedar tree near her shelter. It's a map, one of them said breathlessly. We made it. Jana blinked, touched by the detail. trails drawn as looping lines. The creek marked with 3 waving fish. Tippus rendered as perfect triangles. A spot for the big fire. A rock shaped like a sleeping bear. And right in the center, where all the paths converged, was a circle with a dot in it. "What's this?" she asked. The smaller twin pointed. "That's your home." "And what's written here?" The boys grinned. "It says, where we begin." Her breath caught. She pressed the soft hide against her chest and smiled through the sting in her eyes. They hadn't drawn her as a landmark. They'd drawn her as a beginning. Blank, underscore, blank. When travelers passed through the valley in late harvest, they sometimes lingered near the fire circle, trying to understand the rhythm of a life that didn't speak their language but echoed something deep and old. They asked questions, and the children answered first. "That's Jana," they'd say, proud as drums. "She's ours. Not a guest. Not the chief's woman. Not the widow from some distant town whose name had once shimmered on invitations. Just Jana. Ours. The woman who stayed. Blank, underscore, blank." She was never formally married in their custom. No feathers were placed on her head. No ceremonies announced her claim. But she did not need ceremony to know she belonged. The way the chief waited for her when the tribe moved camp, never ahead, never behind, but always beside her, was marriage in its truest form. The way Toya, nearly grown now, still crept into her arms on the coldest nights and whispered stories against her shoulder, was motherhood at its core. And the way the villagers left baskets of food or carved gifts outside her shelter door was more sacred than offerings to any queen. It wasn't grand, but it was real. It was hers. Blank, underscore, blank. One night, the drums began slowly, not for celebration, but for storytelling, the kind passed between firelight and stars. When shadows danced and memory grew tall. An elder stood, voice rough with age but sure with meaning. "She came to us with no name," the elder said, "or maybe too many names. Names spoken by mouths that never saw her." He turned toward Jana. "But we saw her. She warmed our children, healed our sick, cooked when she could have rested. She gave without being asked. She stayed when others might have left." The elder paused, then looked at the gathered crowd. "And when the snow fell, she stood at the center of us, not above, not below, but among." Toya rose next, carrying a wrapped bundle. She knelt and placed it in Jana's lap. Inside, a new shawl. Bright red, stitched with white deer, lined with patterns that matched the beaded necklace Jana wore daily. The same patterns the girls had taught her to sew. Toya smiled. "My father calls you Firelight," she whispered, "but I call you my mother." Jana wept, but not from sorrow. From joy, from pride, from being known. Not the woman who had once begged for a place at someone's table, but the woman around whom the table was now built. Blank, underscore, blank. The next morning, she stood on the ridge above the valley. The sky was open, streaked with orange and pale blue. Below, the village stirred slowly. Smoke from cook fires rose into the morning calm. Laughter floated up to her like music. Her shawl billowed in the wind. The wind that once carried shame now felt like a song of arrival. Jana watched as Toya directed the younger children gathering kindling, as Kota carved animals from bark, as the twins, always chasing each other, ran barefoot through the moss and wildflowers. All of it began here. With her. With fire that stayed. She smiled, pressing her fingers over her chest, where the necklace Toya had made rested against her skin. And silently, with a pride she didn't have to announce, she whispered the truth. "I am theirs." And for the first time in her life, it was enough. More than enough.